Welcome back. Ethan Malvo here for Is Gun Control Realistic in America? This is part two. As I was saying in the last part, you really can't understand the importance of the gun in American culture until you learn really about the West and what is called the settlement of the West, but really it's the pacification of the West. In case people do not know, I'll just reiterate the story. In the early 19th century, I'm going to say in 1809, as Thomas Jefferson was leaving office, a concept in America got on its way called evangelization. And this is not to be confused with the rise of evangelicals, but the idea of the doctrine of evangelization, that is to say that God had manifest destiny, which is to say that God meant for white people, the European Christian, to conquer and add on to the territory that Thomas Jefferson was able to get from Napoleon, that is to say, the Louisiana Purchase. But the idea of the West and who was going to go out there, who was going to settle it, and it is not a coincidence that the great presidents of the 19th century came from what was then considered to be the West, and that is to say, Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. And this question of the West, I'll also put Andrew Jackson here, because Andrew Jackson had made his career out in the West, and particularly in terms of Louisiana and fighting off the British and defeating them. And the question of the settlement, but who was going to go out to the West and live and be the staple, shall we say, of American values, authority, and commerce. And this was a very troubling thing. Well, of course you needed the gun for this, because you had the Native American who had been pushed out to the West, and it is not readily conveyed in the classroom, and this is why there's so much confusion in terms of the pop culture. We think of, yes, the Native Americans and the slaughter, the inane and the mayhem of even germ warfare. But what we do not realize is that in spite of all of that, it was still a considerably difficult thing in terms of dealing with the Native American. And even in terms of when everybody puts on Andrew Jackson, but it was really the enforcement of Martin Van Buren, and that is the Trail of Tears. But as one of the historians to deal with not only Jackson, but this period, H.W. Brands, has to say is that almost in reality, now this is his opinion, but almost in reality, what Andrew Jackson did in moving many of the Native American nations, namely the Cherokee, out west, really protected them from a genocide warfare that was going on in terms of the white settler. But this was not to last for long. I mean, people did not, because white people in the generality did not really want to traverse and go out there in mass droves. That only started in the 1840s, when gold was thought to be in abundance out in the Midwest. But to make a long story short, the Homestead Act of 1862, which Abraham Lincoln signed in the midst of the Civil War, gave anybody who really wanted to go out west around 160 acres of land. And you did have white settlers go out there, take their guns, and have skirmishes, of course, with the Native Americans, who were promised for a while, at least, that the federal government would not encroach upon them in terms of the treaties that were signed. Well, this turned out to be totally bogus. And after the Civil War was ended, you really had the pacification of the West go on apace. And of course, this is not to mention the new territories that were gained in the Mexican-American War. But especially in terms of Texas, which also has a special connection in terms of gun culture. That too had a lot to do with the settlement criterias and parameters. And as illustrated in many of the movies, even though those were more for entertainment and mythical conceptions, but the one realistic conception was this: that, the West was wild, and law and order and the federal government's reach was limited in the West. Indeed, you can live outside of the purview, and indeed, many of the outlaws, once they robbed banks and everything else, went out west because the federal government was unable to properly and indeed methodically get the West under control. And it was only when things like oil and other resources was discovered out there that the Eastern syndicates, big business, corporations, started to assist, even in terms of corrupt circumstances, to finally bring the West under some kind of control. But when I'm using these words, I'm speaking in generalities. In actuality, the West was never really under control, as we would understand that terminology. The conscription of the people who lived out west was a back and forth of bribery, atrocity, and even just downright chicanery. And this is the reason why people, and particularly going in the Midwest and out west, cling to their guns. Not to echo anything in terms of Barack Obama, but I'm trying to give people an accurate picture of what it is that makes people want to have assault and automatic weapons and everything. In its kernel and in its essence, it is the only way at least in terms of people, the common man, common woman even, to say go to hell to not only the federal government, but also to big business and to the bureaucratic control that tries to on and off, depending on what decade you want to examine, weaken, subvert, whatever you want to call it, the life, the, how can I say it, the prairie life. But more importantly, this type of human being that is produced only in the West now, that seeks to defy all the ground rules. See, this is why in Nevada, for instance, you have, and this is just an aside, the legalization of prostitution and things like that. You see, these people were not ever conscripted in the same way that the sophisticated Americans or the sophisticated people who lived on the East Coast, even further afield out west, namely California and places like that. These people were almost untamable. And that goes to the very essence. It's a part of that, even if it's just now an illusion, a mirage, it goes to that irascibility of the untamable spirit. And that I can have these semi-automatic and even automatic weapons to protect me from being leashed, from being collared, as they say. And, you know, even in terms of those countries that have not had, as we do have, a Second Amendment. You know, the bywanners of South Africa in the year 2000 had to submit to heavy background checks. But the gun is still important because in South Africa, the white person is outnumbered. And so you have to have the gun as a kind of, I don't want to say insurance policy, but as a kind of safety net. And this is what is behind the connotations of the Oscar Pistorius, not only conviction, but scandal and trial. That, you know, you have this uneasy relationship between the Africans and the English and bywanners who remain in South Africa because they are outnumbered. And when Robert Mugabe was on the warpath, confiscating land in Zimbabwe, which was another English territory, you know, the need for guns was quintessential to the white settlers and their, or I should say the descendants of the white settlers, and their protection of their rights. Australia, which never had gun control, you have to remember, these colonies never rebelled against the British, except in terms of the 20th century. But what they did have, and what they eventually were able to comprehend, is that there had to be some modicum, some negation of the gun culture in their countries and societies. And Gretel Kaufman wrote a very interesting article about the gun control laws that were passed in Australia in 1996. Let me see if I can write her name very quickly. Where she said, you know, we had a very heavy gun culture. Let me just write it. And after a massacre that claimed 35 people, I wouldn't say lives, but after a massacre that claimed 35 lives, we had to do something. So they did. And the government passed a law in 1996 that said specifically that all owners of automatic and semi-automatic weapons are coerced into selling back to the government in exchange for money, of course, but to selling back to the government these weapons. And this is how Australia was pacified. And this is how you had such a rigorous gun control work. We will reimburse you the money. If you don't, you stand up for prosecution. But you can never have that here because unlike in Australia, unlike in even Canada or even in South Africa, they don't have any notion of a constitutional right to having a gun. And the way that an American would understand that, they don't have that there. And because, as I said before, they never rebelled against the British, that was just a part of the culture having to do with the history of having to battle and fight and, how can I put this, take the land from the natives in an aggressive fashion, if I could just put it that way. But here in America, you are never going to get that kind of consensus. See, in the films of Sam Peckinpah, TCM did a night of his movies. And I've never been really into Westerns, but his movies were very insightful in terms of this Western character. And I'm not just speaking in terms of the cowboy. I'm speaking in terms of a certain type of person who develops and was developed only by the experience of the West, which was violent, unpredictable, and you cannot have these things in the modern age and call yourself not only civilized, but cosmopolitan. And that is, I think, the bone of contention. That, the gun and, this idea of mass slaughter, even within the culture, gives people the sense, not so much necessarily of security, which it does, and not just in terms of strength, which it does, but the idea of being ready for an adventure, being ready for a situation that I am not tamed, that, I can control this space around me. And that is something that the American, and particularly the American out West, is very much connected to and defined by. Well, I hope this little talk helps you to understand the seriousness of that topic. Now, you may disagree with how I came out and in terms of that thesis of is gun control realistic here in America. But, my opinion is that no, you may have gun control in some limited fashion. As I said, South Africa chose to emphasize the background check rather than the total confiscation of guns, such as in Australia. You may have something like that, but you will never have what will in effect be, I don't care what people may say, an eradication of the constitutional right to carry firearms, even if they are automatic and semi-automatic. Thank you for listening to me. Stay tuned for another Malvo Talk.